Today, I'm gonna show you how I use my favorite tool in Lightroom. And not only my favorite tool, I think this is the second, or if not the most powerful tool in Lightroom, and that is the mask tool. The mask tool, I think, is, if used really well and you incorporate it into your editing, can take your photography to just another level completely. I think it is an underestimated tool a lot of the time. And I found when I used it, and I used it well, it made a huge impact to my photography. So I'm gonna walk you through, I pulled up a whole bunch of images to kind of show you the main ways that I use it, and hopefully these will give you some ideas in how to incorporate it into your own photography editing. So let's get into it. First of all, I just wanna walk you through what I mean by the masking tool if you've never used it before, and some of the kind of new updates over the past couple years that Lightroom has incorporated into it. So let's get into it. Okay, so here it is. I've opened up the mask. It's just how you get to it is through this top tool up here. And there's a whole bunch of options for it. So before I show you all those options, the mask tool is just a way to select specific parts of the photo. And Lightroom has done some incredible advancements in this area, but at its most basic level, you're just selecting areas of the photo to make editing adjustments to it. And I think that's where it's so powerful, is that you can select specific things, whether you're doing kind of some I don't know if it's AI or whatever they're using, but they're using some smart technology to select a person or their face, or it's as simple as just having a brush and using the brush to paint on different photo editing aspects, whether that's exposure or white balance, just to these specific areas, or sharpening, or blurring, or whatever it is. You can do any of those adjustments on a specific area of the photo, and that is very cool. So back to Lightroom. There's some really powerful tools here that make it way easier. I honestly use the brush most of the time. But if there's something quick that I want to do, you can select these different ones. So let's go through it. So you just click on subject, and what it does is it found the subject and selected them, which is crazy. And so then what you can do over on this side is go through and just change the exposure of just the people that it selected. And to give you some context of why even that smart mask is so cool, the traditional masking that you can do in Lightroom, for example, was just a brush. So I've selected a brush, and what you do is just use this brush and you can paint around. Okay, nothing's changed. Well, that's because I haven't selected any settings. So for example, say I want to, darken some areas of this photo, but only specific areas. So I can take this brush and just paint on the settings that I've selected. So I can make it darker. You know what? I feel like that darker area also needs to be more blue. So you can also make it more blue. Okay, so this is obviously looking crazy, but this is just extreme to give you an understanding of kind of how this masking works. Really quickly, some really cool things. So you can just click sky, and as you can tell, it selected the entire sky, which is pretty cool. I think that's something that, I use a lot. That's why I brought up this photo, is because, there's times that maybe you want to be able to bring some of the sky back without bringing the highlights of the whole image back. And I think that's a good example. Another good example here, maybe this one's better, but here, you can just click on the sky, and it's gonna look for the sky, and boom, it found the sky. And so instead of bringing the highlights down or the exposure of the whole image, I'm just selecting the sky and bringing it back. Or maybe, I want to make it look a little extra sunsetty. Okay, now it's getting a little freaky and weird, but you get the point. Really cool. One kind of note of caution that I would give is that with these specific ways to like select certain parts of the image, it can be really easy to overuse it and to make it look very weird. I think that's definitely a danger in using masking, is that you can get really carried away and all of a sudden your images look like very HDR. And if you don't know what HDR is, it's just like when you bring the highlights up and the shadows up, and so that the image is very kind of flat in a way, and you have kind of, it's even in all the areas. The highlights aren't too blown out and the shadows are kind of brought up. And so it kind of makes this very fake looking image. So that's one thing I would say that is always the danger of, like, you know, maybe pulling back the sky, but not pulling it back too much where it starts to look fake and kind of weird, in my opinion. The other main tools that I use are, okay, I already showed you the brush, and then the linear gradient and the radiant gradient. All you do is just like click and drag. And so what this does is creates a gradient. This just makes a way to kind of blend in some editing instead of it maybe being super harsh. So that's kind of the quick overview. I would say in general, I actually really like using the brush and the linear gradient. Those are the ones that I kind of use the most. I have used some of these like quick ways, but I do find it's very easy for the photo to look fake, unless you're doing kind of really specific things that, you know, it would take forever for you just to select their face. So one of the big ways that I really like using masking is when I have weird color casts. Ways that, you know, that happens is maybe you're shooting with a lot of grass in the area, maybe you're shooting with some different incandescent lighting and tungsten lighting that change the color of the image. And here's a good example of this. This is a photo of my wife, Allie, and an example is I don't love maybe how orange the background is. You know, the flash filled Allie pretty well, but it didn't reach the back, and you can tell that there's some like kind of orange color cast there. So what I can do is I can either, you know, select the background, and that's gonna select everything except for Allie, and just pull back, you know, some of that color. So it's not so orange the whole way through. So that's one really great way, and then I'd actually maybe make it even a little bit more magenta feeling, so it's not so kind of like dingy looking. In order for the photo to not look super fake and to keep the kind of the reality of it, I like using the brush tool. And so let me go over here. I'm gonna click create a new mask, and I'm gonna use the brush tool. I really like using it as like a painter would, and then painting in some of these differences. And so what you do, you always make sure you have to like select you know, the setting that you're gonna do, and then just by hand kind of painting in what you want it to look like. And I really enjoy doing it like this. Like, I find it kind of fun and kind of, I don't know, it's like relaxing for me. But I like to choose kind of specific areas and kind of blend in the things that I wanna do. I think this is a good example of where you can really step up the level of your photography by doing, you know, an edit like this. So here's a great photo of a bride, but the thing that I don't love about it is how dark this kind of alcove is. I wish it was a little brighter. I just feel like it's a little dingy, a little too dark for what I was liking. And so what you can do in this scenario is, you know, choose something like, okay, let's select the background, and let's bring up that exposure of everything. So I'm gonna just bring up the exposure, I'm gonna make it a little more contrasty, and I'm also gonna just like add a little bit of magenta in there so it's not so kind of like dead looking in there. Boom, I think that's really beautiful. Now, one thing that it did, that this automatic masking did, is it selected everything. It didn't select just back here, it selected everything. And so what I'm actually gonna do is I can just subtract, and I'm gonna subtract using a brush. And so what I'm gonna do is just subtract all of this stuff out here using a brush. Now, there's probably some other ways that you could do it, like selecting objects and stuff like this. But again, I've told you already, I love using this brush tool. And so whenever I can use it, I like using it. And so I'm just bringing back all this front. And so that's the difference between having this mask and not. I think it just, instead of this like dark, dingy hole, it, I think, did so much to kind of like save the vibes of this photo so that it feels a lot better. Same thing for this shot, same area. where I think the background selection tool can help so much is I've selected the background. And that's, you can just hover over the mask and it shows you, the red means where the masking is over, right? And so I'm gonna do this, and then I'm just gonna bring up the exposure of the background. Now, you can start to see if I bring this up too much, you're like, what is happening to the background? Like, this literally looks like I cut her out and put her on there. So this is where you have to be careful and maybe just like bump it up a little bit, but not too much, because then things start looking very weird. One thing also that you can do instead of just like exposure is changing the, the color tones. And I'm gonna add some magenta back there, and that in my mind helps it not look so dingy, and kind of brings up the vibe of it. So there you go. Here's before and here's after. And I think that is way better. So like I said before, a big time that I use masking is for incandescent lighting. So you can actually see there's already a whole bunch of masks on here. And the reason is because of this chandelier. This chandelier had yellow lighting in it, and you had a lot of this blue natural light. So I had to do a bunch of tricks and painting and everything in order for this image not to look super yellow. So this is what the image looked like beforehand. Now, it looks very weird. The reason I did this was actually I brought down the white balance of the whole image in order to start with the chandelier where I wanted it to start. And then I built everything up after that. So if, just to make it less confusing, this would be like the normal kind of white balance look to, look for her dress to be the normal white balance. And then you can see how yellow this chandelier is. And you're like, what are you supposed to do in this scenario? And so that's when I used tons of these masks to bring up the yellow in the entire image, so that when I can bring the white balance down, it evens out the white balance in the entire image and creates this white looking image, as opposed to like you kind of noticing how yellow the lighting is. Especially when you have a mix of daytime and incandescent lighting, that's when I find photos can look really muddy and horrible looking, because they either look yellow or they look blue. And what I'm trying to do is get rid of as much yellow and blue as possible. And so I think this is a great way to do that. I brought this image in, even though I actually didn't put any masks on this. I thought it was a cool way for you just to look at, like, I don't know, different ways that you could add masks to kind of add some depth and to creativity to your work. And so one thing that I thought was, I saw this little like tea light candle up here. And so what I thought we could do with this photo is use the linear gradient tool and just, I don't know, bring a little bit extra like contrast of this yellow. So in the previous image, I was trying to get rid of all the yellow light. And in this image, I wanted to actually bring in even more of that. So, okay, that's a little extreme, but I really kind of like that kind of like warm feeling that you get from that candlelight. And what I'm doing is just kind of naturally enhancing that by adding a little bit more yellow white balance to it to kind of, add some warmth to this. And so that's like another way that you could do that. I think, again, you can get really crazy with things like that. So I think doing it subtly is always a nice addition. I wouldn't edit that. Like, I kind of like this blue thing, but I was just giving you some ideas of what you could do. This is going back to what I said at the beginning, where if you want to kind of bring up the level of your photography to another level, looking and finding details like this is really important. So what I do not like about this image is how the color and the exposure fell off in this bottom corner. I think it's really distracting. All I want to do is look at this kind of blue bottom corner, and it drives me nuts. And so what I can approach this in two different ways. I think I could do a brush and I could do a gradient. Let me think. I think you could probably use either just fine, but for this one, I'm actually going to use the brush tool. So there are a few things that are important here. The size, which you can make just smaller and bigger by using the bracket keys up and down. Those are kind of the shortcuts. And then, you know, changing the feather, I think can be a big deal in making it look really realistic and natural. So I'm gonna make the feather nice and big, and then density is 100%. So that's just kind of, you know, it's self-explanatory, the density of the settings that we're using. So what I'm gonna do first so I'm gonna start with exposure. So I'm just gonna bump this up a little bit before I start, and then I'm just gonna paint in. And so what I'm gonna do is just bring up the exposure of these corners to match the rest of it so it seems a lot more even. The next thing I'm gonna do is that often when you're looking at shadows in a photo, shadows often have a bluer white balance than, you know, the midtones and the highlights. And so what I'm gonna do is add some warmth to these corners, and this is where you can really tell, you know, this image looks a lot more even. I'm also gonna add a little bit of magenta to it to match the rest of the image. Maybe a little bit more blue. Something that helps me when I'm also doing it is just making the image smaller. Sometimes when it's so big and up in your face, it's hard to tell what you're doing. Okay, so I think this looks way better. I'm gonna add a little bit more to the top here. I actually think I'm a little too yellow. Okay, and there you go. That takes an image that is a beautiful image, but it really brings it up to another level of having, you know, looking for those details of how you can really perfect images without going overboard, without making things look, you know, unreal and unnatural. But how can you really elevate every single image you take to make them, you know, beautiful and as perfect as you can? And so that's after and that's before. And I think that makes a huge impact. What happens with bright and dark spots in photography is that dark spots and bright spots draw your eye in. And so sometimes there's some dark spots and you don't necessarily want your eye to draw there first. And so here's an example of a photo. This is an engagement shoot, and I want this corner. This corner I think is too dark, and this whole wall is a little too bright to where I'm kind of losing some of the rich detail. And I think this is a little too dark where it's looking a little gloomy, and I want it to feel really bright and airy. So what I'm gonna do is actually, there's already a mask in here, but that's for something else. So we're gonna use the linear gradient, and very easily, I'm just gonna click and drag up in this top corner just to brighten this up a little bit. So it's a little less gloomy and a bit brighter. And then I'm gonna do another gradient. I'm gonna click here and then go to linear gradient again, and just drag it across this way. And what that will do is just bring this wall back a little bit. Okay, you know what? I'm not even gonna do exposure. I'm gonna put that back to 0, and I'm just gonna bring the highlights back. So it just ever so slightly brings some of that information back. You know what? I'm not even really liking that. I want to go to the brush. So I'm gonna hit K to create a new brush mask, because what I think that gradient was doing was it was getting the edge, and it was almost making kind of this line of darkness that I didn't want. It's almost the middle that I want to be brought back a little bit and to make it a little darker. So I'm just gonna let me pull down actually the highlights and the exposure just a little bit. And then I'm just gonna paint a little bit in this middle here. What I often like doing is I kind of like going extreme and then pulling it back. I find it's like an easier way to see how the mask is really affecting your photo, and then pulling it back. So I'm gonna go in here just to show you, and I'm gonna go kind of extreme. This is darker than I want it to be, and you can even, you know, do something like that and be like, okay, this is too far. And so what I'll do now is just pull it back until I'm kind of happy to where it is. So it's like, oh, I want a little less than that. Hopefully it's not like back to 0 when I like it. Okay, I kind of like it there. So I know this is subtle, but I think it takes the photo from feeling like a little blown out and overexposed to just perfect. And I like it right there. The last 2 photos that I'm going to show you are actually interior photography. A big situation when you're photographing interiors, or if you're even shooting a wedding inside or whatever, is that lighting is never perfect. And you often have these kind of dark corners, especially the ceiling is often kind of darker than it like should be, or that you'd want it to be. And so here's a great example. I have like, it almost is so dark it kind of looks like vignetting on the lens, but it's not. It's just how the light was coming into the room. And so a great thing that you could do is using the mask tool is evening out. Sorry, I just used K because K is the shortcut for using the brush. You can tell I use this a lot. And just coming in and bringing up the exposure of these corners. And I just think it does so much for interior photography in taking the distraction away from kind of the shadows and letting you actually, see the image for what it is. And so even just quickly doing that, adding just like a little bit of brightness makes such a huge difference. I'm also gonna maybe bring up the warmth a little bit and a little bit magenta. And like the difference between those two images is crazy. And so that is definitely like a little interiors trick when you're shooting photos inside, is just even looking. I'm gonna hit K again to get the shortcut for the brush. And I'm gonna do the same thing here. I'm just gonna like brighten up the ceiling. I'm gonna brighten this dark hallway down here. And I love doing this. I think it's easy to, overdo it, but I just think, wow, that looks so much better. So that is the masking tool. I hope you start using it if you haven't used it. And I hope this gave you some ideas in how you can incorporate this into your own photography. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and I think it's my favorite one in Lightroom.